"It's just beef and bread, Captain. Go on, eat. Ain't no trick." The heat of the Texas sun shimmered off the dry soil as the smell of smoke and sizzling meat drifted across the open ranch. A group of German prisoners, still in their faded Wehrmacht uniforms, stood uncertainly beside a long wooden table. These were soldiers who had once marched through France, fought in Africa, and served under the Black Cross of the Reich. Now they were guests, or at least that's what it felt like. At the center of the group sat Captain Ulrich Stern, a career officer from Hamburg, his boots still polished out of habit. Before him lay a simple meal, a hamburger wrapped in paper, its juices staining through the white parchment, and a bottle of Coca-Cola so cold that condensation ran down its sides. A cowboy with sun-cracked hands and a wide-brimmed hat smiled, offering the plate. Stern hesitated. He looked around, expecting mockery or some hidden, refined cruelty. None came. The ranch hands laughed and joked in English he barely understood. The guards stood nearby, but relaxed, rifles slung low. It felt wrong. It felt impossible. He reached for the burger, his hand trembling slightly. The smell hit him first, warm, rich, unfamiliar. He bit down. The grease and salt flooded his mouth. The flavor was unlike anything he had tasted in years. His jaw froze. The bite stuck in his throat. He set the food down and lowered his head. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, he began to cry. It wasn't the taste of the meat or the sweetness of the soda he tried next that broke him. It was the crushing realization that everything he had been told about America, its cruelty, its barbarism, its supposed decadence, was a lie. The tears came slowly at first, then without restraint. The ranch fell silent, save for the sound of the wind rustling the flags and the cattle lowing in the distance. A guard named Miller stepped forward quietly, unsure what to do. "You all right, sir?" he asked softly. Stern nodded, still unable to speak. He gestured to the meal, then to the men around him, his voice shaking. "In Germany," he whispered, "we had nothing. You give prisoners this." The cowboy scratched his neck, embarrassed. "Ain't right to let a man go hungry. War is bad enough." That line hung in the air, simple and devastating. For the first time, Stern saw his captors not as conquerors, but as human beings who refused to become what their enemy had accused them of being. He looked at the bottle of Coca-Cola, sunlight glinting through the glass. The bubbles danced like laughter. He raised it slightly, as if to toast something greater than victory. That day, on a Texas ranch, a hamburger and a soda did what no bullet or bomb ever could. It broke the spirit of hate that years of war had built. Later in his journal, Stern would write one line that summed up that moment forever. "They defeated us, not with guns, but with grace." By 1943, the war that had shattered Europe began to reach into the quiet farmlands of Texas. Across the state, barbed wire fences rose where cattle once grazed. Guard towers replaced windmills, and army trucks rumbled down dusty roads carrying an unlikely cargo. Thousands of German prisoners of war. In total, more than 425,000 Axis soldiers would be held in the United States during World War II. Of those, over 50,000 Germans found themselves sent to Texas. Scattered across sprawling camps and towns with names like Herne, Mexia, and Huntsville, the American South, with its space, sunshine, and distance from the front lines, became the unlikely home for the men who had once fought under Hitler's banner. Captain Ulrich Stern had been captured in Tunisia during the North African campaign. He had expected the worst. German officers were told that American prisoners were beaten, starved, and humiliated. They were warned that the Allies were savages who respected no rules of war. When Stern's transport train pulled into Camp Herne, he braced for cruelty. Instead, he found order. The guards who lined the platforms were polite but firm. The camp itself was clean, laid out in neat rows of wooden barracks surrounded by tall fences. Inside, the Germans were issued beds with mattresses, soap, and even books from a library stocked with German literature. A small canteen sold cigarettes and coffee. To men who had spent months on the battlefield, it felt surreal. At first, Stern and the others assumed it was some trick. Perhaps this comfort was a way to extract information or to weaken their discipline. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that this treatment wasn't a deception. It was policy. The Geneva Convention, the guards explained, required fair treatment of prisoners. The Americans not only followed it, they exceeded it. Each man received nearly the same rations as US soldiers. Letters home were censored, but allowed. The Red Cross delivered packages. Even religious services were held every Sunday, led by a captured German chaplain. And then there were the guards themselves. Most were young men from small towns, Texans, Kansans, Oklahomans, who treated their prisoners with a mix of respect and curiosity. They called the Germans fellas or boys, not enemies. One Texan, Private Dalton, once told Stern while they walked the fence line, "You fought for your country. We did too. Guess we both did what we were told." For a man raised under totalitarian discipline, that casual acceptance was shocking. In Germany, obedience was survival. Here, it seemed like freedom was. Soon, Stern noticed something else. When the guards looked at him, they didn't see a defeated enemy. They saw a worker, a man, someone who could lend a hand fixing a fence or hauling hay. He began to wonder what kind of nation treated its captives better than its own enemies had treated their allies. Each night as he lay in his bunk, he thought about the strangeness of it all, the clean sheets, the laughter outside the barracks, the smell of barbecue smoke drifting over from nearby ranches. War was supposed to be hate and hunger. But here, behind American wire, there was order, there was dignity. And for Captain Stern, that was more disorienting than any battlefield defeat. By the spring of 1944, the United States faced a new kind of challenge. With millions of young Americans serving overseas, the country's farms, ranches, and factories were short of manpower. Crops went unharvested, fences fell into disrepair, cattle wandered unfenced under the Texas sun. The war needed food, leather, and meat, but there weren't enough hands to supply them. That was when the government turned to an unlikely labor force, the German prisoners. Under the civilian labor program, POWs could volunteer to work outside the camps on farms and ranches across Texas. The Americans saw it as both practical and moral: give men work, pay them a fair wage, and keep them busy. But to the Germans, it sounded like a trap. When Captain Ulrich Stern first heard that he and his men would be sent to work on a local ranch, he expected humiliation. "They will use us like beasts," he told his fellow prisoners. "We will pull plows with ropes around our necks." The next morning, a truck arrived. Not a prison transport, but an old army pickup driven by a smiling cowboy with a wide-brimmed hat. "You boys ever seen a longhorn?" he asked cheerfully. The men didn't know what to say. When they arrived at the ranch, the world seemed to widen. The air smelled of grass and smoke. Horses kicked dust into the wind. The cowboys handed them gloves and hats, not chains. "You'll be fixing fences, moving hay, cleaning stalls. Work hard, and there's lunch at noon." It was unthinkable. The first day was blistering. Texas heat bore down like an open furnace. The Germans sweated through their uniforms, blistered their hands, and muttered about American cruelty. But when the lunch bell rang, the cowboys didn't eat apart from them. They shared food, cold sandwiches, boiled eggs, even a pitcher of iced tea. Stern tried to make sense of it. "They trust us with tools," he whispered to another prisoner. "They eat beside us." "Why?" The answer came from a cowboy named Hank, who spoke slowly, his words heavy with southern drawl. "You're working men, same as us. We don't feed slaves in Texas." By the third week, the POWs started whistling while they worked. They learned to ride in the back of trucks, to patch barbed wire, to mend saddles. They learned American jokes and slang, and the cowboys laughed when they tried to mimic it. Something strange began to happen. The fear started to fade. Stern noticed that when the guards smiled, the men smiled back. The once rigid soldiers now looked forward to work. They even began to hum along to the cowboys' radio, where country music blended with the sound of cattle and wind. Each night the Germans returned to camp covered in dust, but oddly content. "The Americans," Stern wrote in his diary, "do not win by domination. They win by decency." Americans, for men raised to believe in superiority and obedience, Texas was teaching them something revolutionary. Equality wasn't weakness, it was strength. And soon, one barbecue would burn that truth into their hearts forever. By midsummer, the daily rhythm between cowboys and prisoners had settled into something that didn't look like war at all. The ranchers knew the Germans worked hard. The prisoners knew the Americans kept their word. Slowly, a cautious friendship began to form, not through words, but through small, unspoken acts of respect. When one of the POWs twisted his ankle chasing a stray calf, the foreman drove him straight to a local doctor, not the camp medic. When another prisoner complained of blisters, a cowboy handed him a pair of worn leather gloves, saying only, "You'll need these more than me." There were still fences, still rifles at the gate, still the distant reminder that they were enemies, but something was changing in the air. The first sign came one Saturday afternoon, when the foreman invited the POWs to stay late after work. Smoke drifted across the pasture. Music crackled from a dusty radio. The smell of barbecue carried on the wind. The prisoners hesitated. "Is this for us?" one asked, almost afraid to believe it. "Sure is," said the foreman. "You worked like hell this week. It's time to eat like men." The cowboys grilled thick slabs of beef over mesquite coals, flipping them with tongs as sparks rose into the fading light. They passed around cornbread and beans, letting the Germans serve themselves. Some of the prisoners stared at the plates, uncertain. Others laughed nervously. One of the younger cowboys clapped a German soldier on the shoulder. "Don't look so serious, Fritz. You're in Texas now." That broke the tension. Soon the campyard was filled with laughter. Broken English mixed with broken German, the clinking of bottles, the sound of men who were supposed to be enemies sharing a meal. Captain Ulrich Stern stood apart at first, watching. He was a man built from iron habits, trained never to fraternize with the enemy. But as the laughter grew louder, something inside him softened. He joined a group near the grill. One cowboy poured him a Coca-Cola straight from a cooler of ice. "You ever had one of these?" Stern shook his head. The fizz startled him, then made him smile. "This," said the cowboy, raising his own bottle, "is America's secret weapon." Everyone laughed, but Stern didn't. He looked at the dark glass bottle, at the bubbles racing toward the light, and realized the man was right. What defeated Germany wasn't just bombs or tanks. It was this: a country so confident it could share food with its prisoners. When the sun went down, a few of the POWs began singing a quiet German song, something soft and sad. The cowboys didn't stop them. They just kept tending the fire, listening. Stern would later write in his journal, "They are not the monsters we were told they were. They are strong because they choose mercy over hate." That night, as the flames died down, one cowboy said it best: "We fight hard, we work harder, but when the day is done, we all eat." It was the kind of simple truth that could end a war faster than any weapon. The day of the feast began like any other. Dust in the air, the sound of boots on dry earth, cattle lowing in the distance. The sun rose hot and sharp over the Texas plains. For the POWs, it was another workday on the ranch. None of them knew that by noon something would happen they would remember for the rest of their lives. When the truck pulled up, it wasn't loaded with tools or hay. It carried crates of beef, onions, and bottles of Coca-Cola packed in ice. The ranch hands began building a fire pit out of stones, talking and laughing as if preparing for a festival. "What's going on?" one German asked, his voice cautious. "Barbecue," said Hank, the same cowboy who taught them to mend fences. "You boys worked hard. Time to eat like Texans." The prisoners looked at one another, uncertain. In their minds, kindness from an enemy always came with a catch. As the fire crackled and the scent of grilled meat drifted across the pasture, even the most skeptical of them felt their hunger overpower suspicion. They lined up quietly. Each man handed a paper plate with a thick hamburger on a toasted bun, a slice of onion, and a bottle of Coca-Cola so cold the glass fogged in the heat. Captain Ulrich Stern stood near the end of the line, still stiff in his posture, his pride holding him upright even after defeat. When his turn came, Hank handed him a plate and smiled. "Don't worry, Captain. We didn't poison it." The joke broke the tension. Stern actually laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that startled even him. He sat down at the long wooden table. Around him, German soldiers who had once shouted Heil Hitler now murmured simple thanks as they bit into hamburgers for the first time. The sound of chewing, the fizz of soda bottles opening, the murmured laughter, it was a sound no one expected to hear between enemies. Stern took his first bite. The taste of hot beef and salt hit him like a memory of home. but mixed with something new, something he couldn't name. He took a sip of the Coca-Cola. The sweetness and bubbles burned his throat. He coughed, laughed again, and then something inside him broke. He put down the bottle, covered his face, and wept silently. The ranch fell quiet. No one mocked him. No one spoke. Even the cowboys seemed to understand. In that moment, it wasn't about food or drink. It was about disbelief, that an enemy could feed you better than your own army ever did, that a nation you were taught to hate could show you kindness without asking anything in return. Hank, seeing Stearns shaking hands, quietly refilled his cup with more soda and said, "You're all right, Captain. We ain't your enemies anymore." Stern didn't reply. He just nodded, the tears falling freely now, his pride dissolving like ice in the sun. Later, as the men cleaned up, a young POW turned to Stern and asked, "Why do they do this? Why treat us like friends?" Stern looked at the cowboys, their laughter echoing across the field, and said softly, "Because they can. That's why we lost." That night, as he wrote in his journal, he captured it in a single line. They fed us, and in doing so, they starved the hate that had kept us blind. The hamburger and the Coca-Cola had done what years of war could not. They had taught him humility. That night, back inside the camp, the men could barely speak. The taste of the food lingered on their tongues. But the real flavor was something else. Humiliation turned to awe. What they had experienced on that ranch was not just hospitality. It was a form of quiet, devastating victory. Captain Ulrich Stern lay awake on his bunk, his thoughts spinning. All his life, he had been told that Americans were soft, crude, incapable of true discipline. Yet the men he met today, those tanned cowboys with steady hands and easy laughter, were everything Germany's propaganda said they weren't. He thought of the words the cowboy had said before the meal, "We ain't your enemies anymore." It sounded absurd, yet somehow it had felt true. He remembered Berlin's factories, the endless propaganda reels showing heroic workers forging weapons for the fatherland, while real families starved in the ruins. He thought of his own men freezing on the Eastern Front, gnawing on horsemeat while officers hoarded supplies. And then he remembered the Texans feeding their prisoners hamburgers, handing them Coca-Cola as if it were communion. The moral arithmetic didn't make sense. The United States had spent over $1.8 billion building and maintaining its POW camps, nearly the same cost as manufacturing 20,000 Sherman tanks. To a German officer's mind, that was madness, feeding the enemy when your own sons were dying overseas. Unthinkable. Yet the Americans did it without hesitation. That was the real math of victory. Not the number of bullets fired or tanks produced, but the weight of conscience carried by a nation that refused to become the monster it fought. In the dark barracks, Stern opened his small journal and began to write by the faint light of a match. "They defeated us without hatred," he wrote, "without cruelty. They built a system strong enough to spare kindness." Outside, the night was still. Somewhere a guard hummed softly, a cowboy tune. The sound carried through the wire, gentle and haunting. For the first time since the war began, Stern felt peace. Not surrender, but peace, the kind that comes when illusion collapses. In Germany, he had seen civilians whipped for stealing bread. Here he saw captives offered bread freely by their enemies. That contrast hit harder than any bombing raid. The Reich had built its power on fear and obedience. America, he realized, built its power on trust. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet seep in. Tomorrow they would return to work as usual, fixing fences, hauling hay, but nothing would be the same. The war had already ended inside him. He whispered into the darkness. "They conquered us with hamburgers." It sounded ridiculous, yet it was the most honest thing he'd ever said. For all the tanks and planes, all the guns and slogans, the truth was brutally simple. Ideology had collapsed in the face of decency. As Stern drifted into sleep, one final line formed in his mind, a truth he could never admit to his comrades, but would one day tell his children. They defeated us without a single insult, just food. A week after the barbecue, the prisoners were given their monthly privilege to write letters home. Most filled the usual space with reassurance. "I am healthy. I am working. I hope you are safe." But for Captain Ulrich Stern, something in him refused to write the same hollow words. He sat at the long wooden table inside the recreation hut, pen trembling in his hand, the air thick with the scent of dust and sweat. Then he began his letter, not to his wife, but to his brother Karl, who still served in what was left of the Luftwaffe. "Brother," he wrote, "you will not believe this, but the Americans, our enemies, fed us as if we were their neighbors." He described the Cowboys, the laughter, the Coca-Cola, the simple generosity that had struck him harder than any shell. He told Karl that these men did not act like conquerors. They worked beside their captives, trusted them with tools, and even shared jokes that made the long hours bearable. Across the room, another prisoner, young Hans Richter, was writing something similar. His letter began, "Dear Mother, the Americans are nothing like we were told. They don't hate us. They feed us like brothers." Dozens of letters like these crossed the Atlantic weeks later, slipping through censors who didn't recognize the quiet power in their words. When they reached German homes, they landed like whispers of forbidden truth. Mothers wept as they read about kindness from the enemy. Fathers shook their heads in disbelief. Some refused to believe it entirely, calling it Allied propaganda, but others deep down knew it was real. One widow from Hamburg later recalled reading a neighbor's letter aloud. He said the Americans let them work in the sun, that they were given meat and coffee. We could not understand. It sounded like a fairy tale. But the fairy tale spread. Within months, German civilians began to question the regime's lies. If the enemy treated their prisoners better than the Reich treated its soldiers, then who truly represented civilization? Captain Stern never knew the ripple effect of his words. He didn't see the small acts of rebellion his letter inspired. Farmers refusing to inform on neighbors, factory workers slowing production for the collapsing Nazi war machine. But history did. When war ended, Allied intelligence officers would later discover that POW letters from America had a measurable psychological impact. They undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than 1,000 bombers could. Inside the camp, as Stern sealed his envelope, he felt a strange calm. He didn't know whether his letter would survive the journey, but he knew it carried something far more dangerous than any bullet. The truth. He looked out across the Texas plains, where the Cowboys were riding home for the day, and murmured, "If my brother reads this, he'll know what really won the war." And in a sense, he was right. Not steel, not gunpowder, not fire, but the quiet victory of decency. A story written not on battlefields, but on paper, in ink, across an ocean of disbelief. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the camp gates clanged open again. The same dust-coated truck from the ranch rolled in, its engine rumbling low, carrying a familiar figure in a wide-brimmed hat. The prisoners recognized him instantly. The cowboy who'd grilled them hamburgers and served them Coca-Cola, Hank. Hank climbed out of the cab, a small crate in his arms. He walked straight toward the prisoners, smiling the same unshakable smile that had once disarmed their fear. "Morning, boys," he said. "Brought for you." Inside the crate were jars, homemade preserves, their lids sealed tight, labeled in careful handwriting. Peach Jam, Texas, Summer 1945. The Germans stared, stunned into silence. After weeks of tension and reflection, the sight of this man returning with gifts, not orders, not demands, broke the walls that even kindness hadn't yet breached. Captain Stern stepped forward. "Why?" he asked in halting English. "Why bring this for us?" Hank shrugged. "Because war is almost done. You fellas worked hard. My mom made too much jam anyway." The absurd simplicity of it nearly made Stern laugh. This cowboy, who had every reason to hate them, had returned with sweetness. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and accepted one of the jars. For a moment, both men just stood there, the officer and the rancher, the enemy and the host, their eyes meeting across a gulf wider than the Atlantic. Then Hank extended his hand. Stern hesitated, then took it. The handshake was firm, real, not a gesture of surrender or authority, but mutual respect. Around them, the other POWs watched, their expressions unreadable. For many, it was the first time they'd seen a German officer willingly shake an American's hand. Hank chuckled softly. "Guess we're all just folks now, huh?" Stern didn't answer, but his silence said enough. In that grip, he felt something break loose inside him. Not weakness, but relief. The realization that humanity had survived where ideology had failed. Later that evening, when the guards weren't watching closely, the POWs gathered in the barracks. Stern opened the jar with the handle of a spoon. The sweet smell of peaches filled the room. He dipped a finger into the jam, tasted it, and smiled faintly. "Real sugar," he whispered. "Not rationed, not fake." They passed the jar around like a relic, each man taking a taste, each remembering a different life, a different home. For those few minutes, they weren't prisoners. They were men, free, if only in spirit. Outside, the Cowboys' truck rumbled back toward the horizon, a plume of dust trailing behind it. As darkness fell, Stern wrote in his journal, "The cowboy returned today. He brought no sermons, no victory speeches, only sweetness. I have fought for an empire that preached strength and gave hunger. Today an enemy fed me jam and left me in silence. And I think I finally understand what freedom tastes like." He closed the notebook and lay back on his bunk, the jar sitting on the table beside him, catching the last rays of the Texas sunset. Tomorrow the world would continue turning toward peace. But for tonight, the war had already ended, sealed in glass under a label that read, "Texas, Summer, 1945. Weeks later, the war was officially over. The camp loudspeaker blared with static before a voice announced the inevitable. Germany had surrendered. Some men cheered, others wept silently. But for Captain Stern, the moment felt strangely calm, as if he had already surrendered long before Berlin ever did. The POWs were ordered to gather their belongings and prepare for transfer to repatriation centers. The air buzzed with rumors that they'd soon go home, that America would punish them, that freedom might be just another lie. But as the final days unfolded, none of that happened. Instead, the Cowboys came again, not with rifles this time, but with food. The ranchers brought leftover steaks, loaves of bread, and bottles of root beer. There were no speeches, no flags, no celebrations, just one last meal under the open Texas sky. Hank, the same cowboy who'd once handed them hamburgers and peach jam, raised his cup. "To peace," he said. "You boys take this world and make it better than we did." The Germans didn't know how to respond. They simply nodded, clinking their tin cups together. The sound was soft, almost reverent, like a prayer whispered into the wind. Stern ate slowly, watching the smoke from the fire twist into the night. The same hands that had once built weapons now reached for food offered by their enemies. The same men who had once sworn oaths to an empire now sat shoulder to shoulder with Texans who had every reason to despise them. And yet there was no hate, not even resentment, just something else. Understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. Stern took out his small journal one last time and wrote, "They called them cowboys. We called them fools, but it turns out the fools were us." He paused, tapping the pen against the page. Then he added, "We built fear. They built trust. We chained men. They fed them. And somehow that's how they won." After dinner, he walked toward Hank, who was dousing the fire. "You have taught me more about strength," Stern said, his voice quiet, "than all my officers ever did." Hank smiled. "We just try to treat folks right, that's all." The German officer nodded. "Maybe that's the greatest power there is." That night, as the POWs lay in their bunks for the final time, they could hear laughter drifting in from the guards' campfire. It wasn't mocking or cruel. It was simple, human, alive. And in that laughter, Stern realized something profound. The men who had captured them had become their teachers. Not through dominance, but through decency. Years later, when he would tell his grandchildren about his time in America, he would say, "We lost the war in Europe, but in Texas, we found something better. How to be human again." The war had ended with treaties and signatures, but the real victory had happened long before, in the shade of a ranch house, with smoke rising from a grill and the taste of Coca-Cola on the tongue. Because compassion, once shown, can't be unseen, and no prisoner truly remains captive when kindness becomes the lesson. The camp gates opened one last time. Trucks lined the dirt road, ready to take the POWs to the rail station for their long journey home. The Germans loaded their meager belongings, a few letters, a Bible, a tin cup, and for Captain Stern, one small jar of peach jam he'd hidden carefully since that day. He turned one last time to look at the ranch, the dusty fields glowing gold under the Texas sun. The cowboys stood by the fence, hats in hand, not as victors, but as equals. Stern raised his arm in a quiet salute. "You taught us what victory really means," he said softly. Then he climbed into the truck, leaving behind not a prison, but a lesson. As the convoy rumbled away, the wind carried with it the scent of mesquite and barbecue smoke. A place that once held enemies had turned into something sacred, proof that decency could outlive war. They mocked the cowboy once, but in the end it was the cowboy who showed them how men should live. History remembers wars by who won, but sometimes the truest victory belongs to those who chose kindness when cruelty was easier. And somewhere far across the Atlantic, a few German families opened letters from Texas.